1883. The high, brutal summer in Montana Territory had baked the world to the color of old brass. The town of Bitter Willow existed less as a settlement and more as a scar of progress. Clinging to the edge of the high plains, dust was the town's primary currency, a fine, golden-brown powder that coated every hat brim, settled in the bottom of every tin cup, and filmed the eyes of the hopeful and the damned alike. Above the dry rattle of the boardwalks, the air motor windmill spun its constant, lonely rhythm, a metallic heartbeat pumping water from the earth. The sound was a thrumming reassurance against the silence of the prairie. The air itself was a thick tapestry of smells. It smelled of hot leather baking in the sun outside the saddlery. It smelled of the sour, ammonia-sharp tang of horse sweat drying on wool blankets. And underneath it all, carried on a wind that never seemed to stop, was the clean, cold memory of snowmelt running off the distant Garnet Peaks, a ghost of winter haunting the July heat. Marigold Sutton, though no one in Bitter Willow had called her Marigold in 10 years, was driving in all through 3 layers of thick harness leather. She was Goldie, 24 years old, with hands that told a story of hard labor, not of youth. Her palms were shielded with calluses, the skin over her knuckles permanently split, her nails pared short and stained black with neat's foot oil. But those hands were deft, economical, and stronger than most men's. They moved with the quiet certainty of a master craftsman. She was working under the thin strip of shade provided by the saddlery porch, repairing a heavy-duty freight saddle belonging to the bank wagon. The stitching on the skirt had given way, popped by weight and neglect. Goldie worked without pause, her movements precise. She punched a new hole, angled the needle, and pulled the waxed thread taut with a sharp, satisfying zip. Her hair, the color of dark whiskey, was tied back with a simple leather thong. A line of sweat traced its way from her temple, carving a clean path through the fine layer of golden dust on her skin. She kept her eyes on the seam, her focus absolute, as if the entire shrinking world could be held at bay by this single, perfect line of stitches. She did not need to look at the notice posted across the street. She had seen it that morning, and its image was burned onto the back of her eyelids. It was nailed to the front of the post office, hammered right over the territorial assay report with 4 heavy-duty nails, as if to crucify the news. The lettering was stark black, functional, and devoid of pity. Marriage for debt. It was not an invitation. It was a bill of sale. Be it known to the citizens of Bitter Willow that Miss Marigold Sutton, daughter of the late Jedediah Sutton, is hereby betrothed to Mr. Horace Bellamy, Esquire, merchant of grain, Mr. Bellamy, having assumed the outstanding mortgage notes held against the Sutton property and saddlery, takes Miss Sutton's hand in contractual satisfaction of said debt. Goldie could feel the town watching her. She did not look up, but she felt the shift. The blacksmith's hammer across the street had paused its ringing cadence. The 2 prospectors haggling over beans at the general store had fallen silent. Even Mrs. Gable, sweeping the dust from her porch into the dust of the street, had stopped. They were no longer looking at Goldie, the saddler. They were looking at the Sutton collateral. She was an asset being liquidated. Silas Crowley approached, and the air around him seemed to drop a few degrees. He was the owner of the Bitter Willow Bank and Trust, which, by extension, meant he owned Bitter Willow. He was not a large man, but he stood as if he owned the ground his polished boots rested on. He wore a black wool suit, buttoned tight, defying the oppressive heat. His face was pale, smooth, and possessed the cold, impartial flatness of a shovel blade in winter. He stopped just short of her workspace, careful not to get dust on his trousers. He watched the needle flash in her hand. "Miss Sutton," he said. His voice was dry, like papers sliding across a desk. "That repair looks sturdy." Goldie drove the needle through, pulled the thread, and set the next stitch before answering. "It'll hold the bank's money, Mr. Crowley. Sturdiness is an admirable quality." He tapped the small leather ledger he carried under his arm. "As is a sense of obligation." The note your father signed, the one secured by the farm in the spring, comes due tomorrow." He let the word hang in the dry air. "Mr. Bellamy's arrival is fortuitous," Crowley continued, his eyes as blank as glass. "He is a man of commerce, recently arrived and eager to establish himself. He is willing to absorb the principal, the interest, and the penalties in exchange for this marriage contract." Goldie's hands did not stop. Punch. Thread. Pull. Crowley leaned in, lowering his voice. The faint, clean smell of bay rum and stale cigars reached her. "Refusal, of course, simplifies matters for the bank. We will foreclose the land, the saddlery, your father's horses, and," he added, his voice dropping to a near whisper, "the cotton draw spring. All of it, by sundown tomorrow." He knew, and she knew, that the spring was the true prize. In this territory, water was not just life, it was power. The cotton draw spring was the only reliable water source on this side of the valley, and it belonged to the Sutton land. Goldie tied off the stitch with a vicious yank. She finally looked up, not at Crowley, but at the town. The faces that had turned away when he approached now snapped back, feigning indifference. May, the formidable woman who ran the Mule's Ear Saloon, was smoking a thin cigarillo in the shade of her doorway. She had seen more booms and busts, more hope and ruin than anyone in town. She caught Goldie's eye and gave a single, almost imperceptible shake of her head. It was not a gesture of help. It was one of commiseration. Later that afternoon, as Goldie walked to the well to fetch water, May stepped out. Her voice was low, rough from whiskey and sympathy. "Debt gets married first out here, honey," May murmured, tapping the ash from her cigarillo. "The heart comes later, if it comes at all." Far from the stifling heat and quiet judgments of Bitter Willow, the wind moved with cold purpose. High on the Garnet Ridge, miles away, a lone rider sat his horse, watching the distant shimmer of the town. He was a man who blended with the rock and the struggling pines, a figure of absolute stillness. This was Thaddeus Pike. The winter range, the high, cold, unforgiving spread of land that stretched up the side of the Garnet Mountains, was his. It was country nobody else wanted, which was why he had claimed it. He was a man carved from silence. His wife, Ilara, had been gone 2 winters past. The fever had taken her in 3 days, leaving nothing behind but a space that Pike could not fill. He had buried her himself, high up where the wild columbines bloomed in the spring. Since that day, he had probably spoken no more than 500 words aloud. He lived with the herd of wild horses that grazed his high meadows, and an emptiness so vast it felt like the sky had fallen in and settled in his chest. He was not weary from the ride. He was weary from the simple, grinding act of breathing. He looked like one of the solitary, wind-blasted pines that dotted his land, damaged, but stubbornly, silently, standing. He watched the dust cloud that marked Bitter Willow. His eyes narrowed against the glare. He felt nothing for the town. It was just a place he passed on his way to somewhere else. He was just checking the horizon before turning his horse back toward the cold comfort of his empty ranch house. Back in town, the sun was finally bleeding out behind the western hills, painting the sky in shades of bruised purple and angry orange. Goldie set the last copper rivet in the repaired saddle. She hammered it flat, the sharp thwack, thwack, thwack of metal on metal echoing in the cooling street. It was done. She tested the joint with her full weight. Solid. She was wiping the black grease from her hands onto a cotton rag when Crowley emerged from the bank's shadow. He had been waiting, she realized. Waiting for her to finish the job he had paid her for, before reminding her of the one she had not. He walked with her as she carried the heavy saddle to the bank wagon, his steps silent on the dust. She heaved it up, settling it onto the wagon bed. He smiled, a fractional lift of the right side of his mouth that held no warmth at all. "Excellent work, Miss Sutton. Truly." He leaned in, so close she could feel the faint warmth of his breath. His voice was a dry, reptilian rasp, meant only for her ear. "Is your dress ordered, mister? Bellamy is a punctual man. He arrives on the noon stage, tomorrow." It was not a question. It was the sound of the trap springing shut. Crowley tipped his hat, a gesture of empty courtesy, and turned, walking back into the deepening shadow of his bank. The street was suddenly quiet. The blacksmith's forge was dark. The ever-present thrum-thrum of the windmills seemed to mock her. Goldie stood frozen for a long minute. The hickory handle of her saddler's hammer still gripped tight in her right hand. Her knuckles were white. The wood bit into the calluses of her palm. The wind shifted. It was coming from the east now, carrying a new scent, something sharp and acrid beneath the familiar smells of pine and alkali. Smoke. It was a distant grass fire, somewhere far out in the high plains, maybe a controlled burn to clear brush, or maybe just trouble starting. She turned her back on the bank, on the saloon, on the entire silent, watching town. She looked past the rooftops, past the dusty foothills, toward the high, dark line of the Garnet Ridge, now just a silhouette against the dying light. She saw nothing but the deepening blue-purple shadows, but she stared, gripping the hammer so hard her arm trembling. It felt, for one impossible second, as if she could hear a single, ragged sigh carried on that smoky wind, a deep breath drawn and released that did not belong to Bitter Willow. It was a loneliness vast as the prairie, a quiet exhaustion that almost, terrifyingly, matched her own. The lamp in the back room of the saddlery smoked, casting a sickly yellow light. It was past midnight. The town of Bitter Willow was asleep, but Goldie Sutton was not. She was on her knees before a low, heavy trunk made of camphor wood, the one that had come overland with her mother. The air was thick with the smell of old, dry leather, her father's pipe tobacco, and the faint, sweet scent of dried lavender her mother had tucked into the corners. Her hands, raw from the day's work and shaking with adrenaline, fumbled with the rusted lock. She forced it. The hinges screamed in protest. This was not a hunt for money. This was a hunt for a memory, a weapon. Her father, a good man with horses, but a poor man with ledgers, had left only debt, but her mother had been different. She had been the one who understood the land. Goldie dug past bundles of letters, a christening gown wrapped in tissue, and her father's cavalry discharge papers. Beneath it all, at the very bottom, was an oilcloth packet tied with a rawhide string. Her fingers stiffened. She pulled it out. The oilcloth was stiff, cracking at the folds. Inside was a single sheet of heavy, linen-based paper, folded into quarters. It was not a banknote. It was a compact, written in the looping, precise hand of a territorial judge long since dead. The ink was faded to the color of a rust stain. It was the water contract. She remembered her mother telling the story a prospector, broken and dying of thirst, had stumbled onto their land. Her mother had nursed him for a month. In return, he gave her the only thing he had the original surveyor's claim to the Cotton Draw Spring, which he had filed in Helena years before, predating the town itself. Goldie's eyes scanned the legal script, her lips moving silently, sounding out the difficult words. Then she found it, the seal of the territory, faint but visible, and the clause, written in clean, unambiguous script. The rights to the water sourced at Cotton Draw, its stream and aquifer, shall be held by the Sutton line. In the event of the death of Jedediah Sutton, said rights shall pass not to the estate, but directly to the eldest living female heir, to hold in trust. These rights cannot be bartered, sold, mortgaged, or transferred, save by her own voluntary signature. Voluntary. The word hit her like a physical blow. She read it again. Voluntary. Crowley had not mentioned this. He had only mentioned the land mortgage. The mortgage her father signed secured the dirt, the buildings, the pasture. But it did not secure the water. The water was separate. It was hers. A wild, sharp hope, as painful as a fresh cut, pierced through her numbness. She did not wait for dawn. She ran, the paper clutched in her hand, down the dark main street to the small building that served as the sheriff's office and jail. A light was still on. Maeve O'Rourke sat at her desk, boots propped up, cleaning her sidearm. She was Goldie's oldest friend, And now, the town's only deputy. Her hair was the color of a dark copper strike, pulled back in a severe braid that emphasized the freckles scattered across her nose. She looked up as Goldie burst in, her hand automatically moving toward the weapon. "Goldie, what in God's name?" Goldie slapped the paper down on the desk, her breath coming in ragged gasps. "He can't, can he? He can't take the water. My mother." Maeve picked up the compact. She read it once, then twice, her expression hardening. She was the law, and she understood the brutal algebra of it. She walked to the window, staring out at the dark shape of the bank across the street. "He's not taking it, Goldie," Maeve said, her voice low and furious. "He's buying it, from you. But I won't sign. It says voluntary." "That's the trick," Maeve said, turning back. The lamplight caught the hard line of her jaw. "This is why Bellamy. This is why the marriage. It's not a lien. Goldie, it's a loophole." Maeve leaned against the desk. "Crowley is a snake. He knows he can't force your signature. So, he's tying the debt to the wedding vows. The moment you say 'I do' to Bellamy, you become his wife. Under the law, your property, your rights, your signature, they all become his. He won't need your voluntary signature, because he will own the hand that signs. He's not breaking the law. He's twisting it into a noose." The hope in Goldie's chest turned to ice. "So, I have no choice." "You have a choice," Maeve said. "You refuse, and Crowley forecloses. He takes the land, the saddlery, everything but the water. You'll be left with a spring in the middle of land he owns, and he'll fence you out until you starve. Or you marry Bellamy, and he gets it all. It's the same cage. Goldie, just painted a different color." Goldie took the paper, her hand steady now. The tremor was gone, replaced by a cold, hard rage. "No, there's a difference. He wants the water. He doesn't just want the land. He needs the water. What are you going to do?" "I don't know," Goldie whispered. "I'm going to keep this." She folded the compact and tucked it into the leather satchel she used for deliveries. "Be careful," Maeve warned, her eyes dark. "A man like Crowley doesn't build a trap like this without guarding the bait." The warning came too late. Goldie left the jail, walking not down the main street, but through the narrow alley that ran behind the general store. It was faster. The moon was hidden, and the alley was a pitch-black canyon of trash barrels and stacked crates, smelling of sour milk and stale whiskey. She was halfway through when two shadows detached themselves from a doorway. "Mr. Crowley just wants the papers. Miss Sutton." The voice was rough, unfamiliar. Goldie spun, her satchel clutched to her chest. She saw the shape of two men, both larger than her. "They didn't draw guns. They were here to send a message, and to steal." One lunged, grabbing the satchel's strap. The leather, old and oiled, held for a second. Goldie, acting on pure instinct, did not pull back. She drove forward, slamming her shoulder into the man's chest. He grunted, surprised by the force. The second man grabbed her arm. She twisted, her saddler's strength wrenching her free, and swung the heavy satchel like a club. It hit him in the face with a solid thwack. He cursed, stumbling back. The first man grabbed the strap again, yanking it hard. The brass buckle snapped. The satchel flew from her grasp, spilling its contents into the dark dust. "Grab it!" Goldie dove for the oilcloth packet, her hands scraping the gravel. She got her fingers around it just as a boot came down, missing her hand by an inch. She scrambled to her feet, backing away, clutching the water compact. "Maeve!" she screamed, a sharp, desperate sound. The men paused. They looked at the scattered contents, a ledger, some spare buckles, a few order forms, then looked at her, empty-handed save for the one packet she'd retrieved. "Forget it. It ain't worth a shooting," one muttered. They vanished back into the shadows just as the back door of the jailhouse slammed open. Maeve standing in the rectangle of light, shotgun in hand, but they were gone. Goldie was shaking, breathing hard. "I'm all right," she called out. She knelt, gathering her scattered things. In the dark, She didn't see the single sheet of folded paper that had fluttered under a crate. It was a delivery manifest, dropped by one of the men. It listed, in precise black ink, Bellamy Grain Company, 10 sections, galvanized pipe, delivery cotton draw, expected arrival Sunday, post Vows. By noon the next day, the rumor was all over town. It had started with the stage driver, who'd overheard Bellamy's men talking in the next town over. Horace Bellamy wasn't just a merchant. He was building the largest grain depot in the territory, a depot that would need tens of thousands of gallons of water a day, year-round, to run its steam-powered mill and sluice. Suddenly, the marriage made perfect. Terrible sense. Goldie Sutton wasn't the prize. The cotton draw spring was. The wedding was just the legal key to unlock the pipeline, miles away, on the high frontier. Thaddeus Pike smelled the smoke again. This time it was thicker, darker, and closer. It was not the clean scent of a pine fire. It was the greasy, acrid smell of burning prairie grass, choked with sage. He spurred his horse to the edge of the ridge he called the Widow's Leap. Far below, in the eastern basin, a line of black smoke stretched for a mile, moving steadily. He saw the riders, tiny figures of men on horseback, riding behind the fire. They were pushing a herd of wild horses, maybe 50 head, using the wall of flames to force them toward a box canyon trap. Thaddeus's face, already weathered and creased, tightened, fire-hurting. It was a brutal, wasteful way to catch mustangs, scarring the land for a decade just to save a few days' work. It was something only men with deep pockets and no respect for the range would do. Men with money. It was the smell of progress, and it felt like an invasion. He turned his horse. He needed supplies. He needed to hear the talk. He needed to know who was burning his world. He rode into Bitter Willow just as the sun was hitting its peak, a merciless white eye in the sky. His duster was pale with alkali dust. He dismounted, tying his horse to the hitching rail outside the Mule's Ear Saloon. He moved with the slow, deliberate economy of a man who lives alone, a man who has nothing left to hurry for. The saloon was loud, the midday din of miners, freighters, and drifters. The moment Thaddeus Pike pushed open the bat-wing doors, the noise collapsed. The piano player's hands froze over the keys. A poker game stopped mid-deal. Pike was a known figure, but not a welcome one. He was the man from the Winter Range, the widower, the ghost of the mountain. He represented the high, cold loneliness that everyone in this dusty town was trying to drink or gamble away. He walked to the bar, ignoring the stares. His eyes, pale blue and exhausted from years of scanning empty horizons, held no fear. A man with nothing left to lose is a hard man to threaten. "Water," he said to May, the saloon owner. She nodded, drawing a glass from the well bucket, sliding it toward him. As he drank, a voice cut through the silence. It was a local man, a coyote who did odd, ugly jobs for Silas Crowley. "Well, look who's down from the mountain," the man sneered, emboldened by Crowley's protection. "Heard it's getting right dry up on the Winter Range. Pike." Thaddeus said nothing. He finished the water. The man smirked, leaning back in his chair. "Word is, it's about to get a whole lot drier. Water likes to follow the money, and you, friend, ain't got none." Thaddeus Pike set the glass down on the bar. The simple sound of glass on wood was sharp, final. He turned slowly, his gaze sweeping over the coyote, indifferent, as if looking at a piece of furniture, and then his eyes kept moving. Standing in the side entrance, having just come from the kitchen to deliver a mended saddle strap, was Goldie Sutton. She was frozen, caught in the sudden, heavy silence. Her hands were stained with oil, her face smudged with dust from the alley. She looked cornered, tired, and absolutely defiant. She had heard the taunt, and she was looking directly at the coyote who had said it. Pike saw her. He had seen her in town before, the saddler's girl, just part of the scenery. But he had never looked at her. He saw her now. Her eyes, the color of wet slate, met his. They were not the eyes of a victim. They were not the eyes of a bride. They were the sharpest things he had ever seen. Hot and bright and dangerous, like the edge of a brand new, freshly honed blade. The saloon doors had not yet swung shut behind Thaddeus Pike before Goldie was in the street. The dust was thick and hot, clinging to her boots. He was already at his horse, a rangy, slate-gray gelding with intelligent eyes. He was not checking his gear. He was simply standing by its head, as if waiting. She stopped 5 feet from him. The man from the high ridge, the man who smelled of pine and altitude. His stillness was unnerving. "You know the high trails," Goldie stated. It was not a question. He turned his head. His pale eyes settled on her, unblinking. "I have to get this to Helena," she said, her hand flat on the leather satchel at her hip, where the oilcloth-wrapped contract now rested. "The main road. Crowley has men watching the stage depot." Thaddeus looked past her, toward the black-suited figure of Silas Crowley, who had emerged from the bank, watching them both from across the street. Then his gaze returned to her. He saw the desperation, but he also saw the unbending iron beneath it. "Helena is a 3-day ride," he said. His voice was rough, like gravel over ice. "And you have a wedding on Sunday." "I have to try," she said, her voice tight. "I need an escort. I can pay, not much, but I'm not for hire, Miss Sutton." Her face fell, but the anger returned just as quickly. "Then you'll let him take your water too, because he will." A muscle in his jaw tightened. He had heard the talk in the saloon. He had seen the way the coyote had spoken of the winter range. He had put the pieces together. The fire herding, the grain depot, the water. He looped his horse's reins over the rail. "Helena is too far," he said, his back to her as he checked his cinch strap, pulling it tight. "The circuit judge, Hollister, is in Milltown. That's a day, a hard day. Will you take me?" He tested the strap, satisfied. He turned, looking down at her. "I'll take you, but we leave now, and you ride a horse that listens." He did not wait for her answer. He strode to the livery, emerging minutes later with her own buckskin mare, already saddled. He had paid her livery fee. He moved, she realized, with a quiet, devastating efficiency. They left Bitter Willow without a backward glance, not by the main road, but by a dry wash that cut north toward the high country. The Twin Spur Ridge was a backbone of fractured granite, a place where the wind never stopped and the world fell away on either side into canyons choked with juniper. There was no trail, only a suggestion of a path worn by wild goats. The sky, which had been a clear, merciless blue, began to curdle. By mid-afternoon, it was the color of a fresh bruise, yellow and purple, and the air was heavy, smelling of ozone and wet rock. The storm did not arrive. It attacked. It exploded over the ridge with the sudden violence of a gunshot. A wall of wind hit them first, nearly tearing Goldie from the saddle. Then came the rain, a solid, blinding sheet of ice-cold water that turned the granite slick as glass. The world vanished beyond the head of her horse. Thunder cracked directly overhead, an immediate, deafening cannonade that seemed to shake the very rock beneath them. Her buckskin mare, usually steady, screamed and reared. Goldie, a lifetime of horse sense in her hands, did not fight the reins. She went with the horse, her body fluid, absorbing the panic, her voice a low, steady sound lost in the roar of the wind. "Easy, easy, girl. I've got you." Thaddeus's gray, more seasoned, merely danced, turning its rump to the wind. He fought his mount to a standstill and looked back, expecting to see her thrown. He saw her, soaked to the skin, her hair plastered to her face, fighting the mare. The horse lunged, panicked by the lightning, and Goldie's hat was ripped from her head, vanishing into the gray void. She didn't flinch, with the rain lashing her face. Her hands, steady and sure, reached forward. She unbuckled the noseband of the bridle and, with a swift, practiced motion, rethreaded it, crossing the strap under the horse's jaw and up the other side, a cross tie. It was a harsh, effective technique, one that applied immediate, undeniable pressure. The mare tossed her head once, fought the pressure, and then, miraculously, stood, trembling, but held, Thaddeus just watched. He had seen rough-handed men do that. He had never seen it done with such calm, economical grace. Her voice never stopped. A low, constant vibration that was part command, part comfort. "There's cover!" he yelled over the wind, pointing to a dark slash in the rock face, a shallow overhang worn into the cliff. They pushed the terrified horses into the shallow cleft, a space barely 10 feet deep. It was not dry, but it broke the wind and the direct assault of the rain. The storm raged around them, a world of noise and moving water. They stood, dripping, in the sudden echoing silence of the shelter, the sound of their own harsh breathing filling the space. Goldie was shaking. The cold was profound, sinking straight into her bones. She began fumbling in her satchel, her fingers numb, trying to find the oilcloth packet that held her flint and steel. I can make a fire," she stammered, her teeth chattering. The flint slipped from her numb fingers, clattering onto the stone floor. Thaddeus said nothing. He simply stepped toward her. She looked up, startled by his closeness. He was a wall of wet wool and cold leather. He did not bother with the flint. Instead, he unbuttoned his greatcoat. It was a heavy, sheepskin-lined canvas duster, dark with water, but the inside was still warm from his body. He didn't ask. He simply lifted it and draped it over her shoulders. Goldie was instantly swallowed. The coat was massive, weighing her down, but it was warm. The retained heat of his body enveloped her. It smelled of pine smoke, wet wool, horse, and something else. Something clean and metallic like the cold mountain air. The shaking in her shoulders began to ease. They stood, separated by only a foot of stone, watching the rain. The proximity was a tangible thing, as loud as the thunder. There was only the sound of the storm, the nervous stamp of the horses behind them, and the dual rhythm of their breathing. He knelt, picked up her flint, and with one sure scraping strike, lit the small bundle of tinder and dry sticks he'd pulled from his own saddlebag. A small, smoky fire began to crackle, fighting the damp. Goldie huddled closer to the small flame, pulling the heavy coat tight. The silence stretched, filled only by the storm. "It's on Sunday," she said, her voice quiet, directed at the fire. "The wedding?" Thaddeus was checking the straps on his saddlebags, his back to her, his hands, large and scarred, stilled. "He arrives tomorrow, on the noon stage." He turned. His face was all angles and shadows in the flickering firelight. "Are you saying yes?" he asked. The question was flat, without judgment, a simple request for data. She finally looked at him. Her eyes, in the gloom, seemed impossibly bright. "I'm not saying yes. They're saying it for me," she told him then. The words came out in a low, cold rush. The debt, the contract, the legal trap that turned her vows into a signature. Thaddeus listened, his expression unchanging. When she finished, he simply nodded, as if she had confirmed something he already knew. He walked to his saddlebag and pulled out a battered tin map case. He unrolled a piece of oilcloth on the ground. It was a map, hand-drawn in faded ink. "Crowley's man in the saloon. He spoke of my land." He tapped the map. "This is Winter Range." His finger, blunt and stained, traced a thin blue line. "This is Cotton Draw. It starts here, high up, my land. It runs 2 miles through my pasture before it ever drops to the valley floor, before it ever reaches your property." Goldie knelt beside him, the greatcoat pooling around her. She saw it instantly. Her father's land, the town, all of it was downstream. "If they run a pipe from the source," she whispered. "They won't just take your water," Thaddeus said, his voice a low rumble. "They will dry out my entire summer pasture. They'll dry me out first." Their stakes were not just similar, they were identical. A crack of lightning, brighter than day, illuminated the shelter in a stark, white flash. The thunder was instantaneous, a physical blow that shook the ground. The horses screamed, rearing in the confined space. Goldie cried out, throwing her hands up as her mare's front hoof lashed out. She was thrown off balance, falling backward, directly into Thaddeus. He moved, not to catch her, but to shield her, turning his body to put himself between her and the panicking animals. She landed hard against his chest. Her hands flew up to brace herself, her palms flat against the solid wall of his sternum. Her forehead hit his shoulder, and she instinctively pressed against him, a desperate bid for solid ground in the chaos. He was like the mountain, unmovable. She could feel the solid, steady beat of his heart under her hand, a slow, powerful rhythm that was the antithesis of the storm. He did not embrace her. He simply stood, a bulwark, his hands up, ready to ward off a blow. The horses settled, snorting and wild-eyed. The thunder rolled away, and they were left, frozen in that accidental embrace. She was pressed against him, her face against the wet wool of his shirt. He was looking down at the top of her head. Slowly, she pulled back, but only an inch. She looked up. He looked down. It was a look that lasted far, far longer than the town of Bitter Willow would have allowed. In the dim, smoky light, they saw each other. She saw, for the first time, the profound, arctic loneliness in his eyes, a stillness that came from having lost everything. And he saw, past the dirt and the fear, the white-hot core of her defiance. He saw a woman who would not be broken. They both realized in that instant, the same kind of creature. They were survivors, built for the high, cold, unforgiving places. His voice, when he spoke, was a near whisper, meant only for her. "This water contract, you have it." She nodded, her hand still resting on his chest. "If you want to stop this," he said, his eyes holding hers. "The law doesn't just need the paper. It needs proof of force, proof of coercion." Goldie's breath hitched. He had given her the word. He had given her the weapon. She pulled away, pulling the heavy, warm coat around her. It was her armor now. She was no longer shaking from the cold. She was vibrating with a new, cold purpose. "Coercion," she said. She nodded, not to him, but to herself. She had found her footing on the slick rock. She had put her trust in the one man in the territory who had nothing left to promise anyone, nothing but a silence that did not lie. The church fundraiser, as the cream-colored invitations called it, was nothing of the sort. Silas Crowley had commandeered the town hall, and the entire population of Bitter Willow was present, compelled by a mixture of fear, curiosity, and the grim obligation of a community forced to witness a sacrifice. The hall was hot, smelling of pine plank floors, beeswax polish, and the nervous sweat of the guests. A small trio, a wheezing fiddle, a banjo, and a tinny piano played vaguely cheerful tunes that fought with the oppressive atmosphere. Long tables were laden with lemonade and seed cakes, a veneer of civilization pasted over a brutal transaction. The invitations, stacked on a table by the door, were pristine, an evening of community, vows to be spoken at dusk. Goldie had arrived alone. She wore her Sunday best, a dark blue cotton dress, starched and stiff. It was the only dress she owned that wasn't stained with oil. She had refused to buy or make a new one. But in a small, sharp act of defiance, she still wore her work belt, stripped of its heavy tools but still bearing the leather strap where she hung her keys and her all. It was a reminder, to herself and to them, of who she was. Maeve O'Rourke was there, not in her deputy's uniform, but in a simple skirt, her presence an unofficial surveillance. She had met Goldie an hour before, pressing a folded document into her hand. "This is a temporary warrant from Judge Hollister," Maeve had whispered, her voice tight. "He's suspicious of Crowley's land grabs, but he needs proof of a crime. This warrant gives me cause to search the bank's transaction vault. But it's only good if I have a clear reason to suspect a specific crime, coercion, forgery." She had looked at Goldie, her eyes hard. "Crowley's vault is timed. I need a distraction, a real one, something that pulls every eye, especially his and Goldie. I need to know what I'm looking for. Bellamy must have a key. I need to see it. I need to know if it's the main vault or a private safe." Now, the man himself was at the door. Horace Bellamy had arrived on the noon stage. just as promised. He was not what Goldie had expected. He was not a grizzled ruffian. He was worse. He was handsome, smooth, and dressed in an impeccably tailored suit of gray wool that seemed to repel the town's dust. He smelled of expensive bay rum and cloves, a civilized scent that was an offense in the dry, hot room. Crowley presented him to Goldie as a butcher presents his finest cut. "Mr. Bellamy, may I present your fiancée, Miss Marigold Sutton?" Bellamy took her hand. His own was soft, warm, and held no calluses. He did not kiss her knuckles. He simply held her hand, his thumb pressing gently into her palm, a gesture of casual, immediate ownership. "Miss Sutton," he said, his voice a smooth baritone, "you are even more resilient than Mr. Crowley described." His smile was perfect, white and sharp. It was, Goldie thought, like a surgeon's blade wrapped in velvet. His eyes drifted from her face, down to her waist. They did not linger on her figure, but on the leather strap at her belt. He smiled, a slight, appreciative twitch. "How practical. You carry the keys to your domain, a woman who values access. I admire that." He was obsessed with keys. He was obsessed with ownership. He released her hand and turned to the crowd, charming, at ease, already the master of the room. Across the hall, by the tall, open doors that led to the porch, a figure stood in the deepening shadow. Thaddeus Pike had not been invited, and he had not come as a guest. He wore a clean black shirt, his dark, wide-brimmed hat pulled low. He was a piece of the mountain that had lodged itself in the corner of the room. Immovable and silent, he was a neutral shadow, his pale eyes missing nothing, fixed not on Bellamy, not on Crowley, but on Goldie. His presence was an anchor, a silent question she had not yet answered. The fiddle struck up a waltz. The music was thin and strained. Bellamy, the perfect gentleman, turned to Goldie. "They are playing our song, my dear," he murmured, his hand already at the small of her back. He did not ask her to dance. He told her. He steered her onto the floor. He was a good dancer, smooth and practiced, but Goldie was stiff. She was a woman used to bracing her body against horses and leather, not yielding to a man's lead. Maeve was by the punch bowl, watching. Her eyes met Goldie's over Bellamy's shoulder. Goldie gave a tiny, almost invisible, shake of her head. "Not yet." Bellamy smiled, pulling her a fraction closer. "You must relax. Marigold, a worthy position awaits you. You will be the mistress of the largest grain concern in this territory. You will want for nothing. And you," she said, her voice low and steady, "will have your water." His smile did not falter, but his eyes went cold. "The water is the land is the woman. The contract is complete. It is simple commerce." "It's coercion," she whispered. He laughed, a soft, pleasant sound. "That is a word for judges. My dear, we are speaking of marriage." As he spun her in a tight circle, the fiddle reaching a reedy crescendo, Goldie enacted the plan. She let her knees buckle slightly, as if stumbling on the hem of her dress. She lurched, not against him, but away, tearing her hand from his, the small leather satchel she'd carried, filled with her heavy awl, a tin of wax, and a handful of steel needles, slipped from her grasp. It hit the floor with a heavy, metallic thud. The contents scattered across the waxed planks. "Oh," she cried, a false, sharp sound. "Bellamy, the gentleman, reacted instantly. My dear, how clumsy." He stooped, bending low to retrieve her things. As he bent, his fine gray waistcoat pulled taut across his chest. Goldie and Maeve both saw it at the same moment. Tucked into his vest pocket, secured by a heavy gold chain, was a ring of keys. One was a simple latch key, but the other, flat, heavy, and made of brass, was a double-bitted safe key. The key to the bank's records vault. From across the room, Maeve O'Rourke gave a single, sharp nod. Signal received. Bellamy gathered her things, his smile now thin and strained. He did not like being on his knees. As he rose, Goldie grabbed her bag and pulled away. I need some air." She fled the dance floor, pushing past the staring guests, and burst onto the wide, dark porch. The air was cooler, the music muffled. She leaned against the rail, her heart hammering. Two shadows detached themselves from the corner of the building. It was the two men from the alley. That was a foolish little game. Miss Sutton. The rougher one growled. They moved to block her, one on each side. The town was behind her, the dark prairie in front. She was trapped. Mr. Crowley is a patient man, the second one said, stepping closer. But his patience is gone. You will go back in there. You will stand up with Mr. Bellamy, and you will say your vows. Or what? Goldie snapped. The first man grabbed her arm, his fingers biting into her flesh like a steel trap. Or we ride to Cotton Draw tonight. We fence the spring, and we put a guard on it. Mr. Bellamy will have his water, one way or another. You can sign, or you can watch this whole valley's stock die of thirst. Starting with your own. It was the final turn of the screw. Coercion. Take your hands off her. The voice came from the deepest shadow of the porch, a low rumble that was more vibration than sound. Thaddeus Pike stepped into the faint light from the doorway. He had not followed her. He had anticipated this. He was not armed, his hands empty at his sides. The man holding Goldie laughed. And who are you, her guardian angel? He gave Goldie a vicious shake. Stay out of this, old man. Thaddeus moved. He did not lunge. He did not swing. He simply closed the distance in one silent, explosive step. His movement was liquid, the fast-as-lightning strike of a snake. Before the man could even turn, Thaddeus's hand, open, struck the man's wrist, breaking the grip on Goldie. At the same instant, his other hand, balled into a fist, traveled a short, brutal 6 inches. It connected with the man's jaw with a sickening crack of bone. It was not a barroom punch. It was an execution of force. The man's eyes went blank. He did not fall. He was thrown backward, crashing through the porch rail and landing in a stack of empty cider barrels by the side of the hall. The sound of splintering wood and the heavy impact was cannon loud in the night. The fiddle music stopped, screeching to a halt mid-note. The hall door burst open, spilling yellow light and shocked guests onto the porch. The second henchman, stunned, fumbled for a gun he did not have. Thaddeus simply turned his pale eyes on him. The man froze, then scrambled backward, vanishing into the night. Crowley was the first one through the door, his face purple with rage. Behind him was Horace Bellamy, his civilized mask finally gone, his face a mask of cold fury. Bellamy looked at the man groaning in the wreckage of the barrels. He looked at Goldie, standing, free, beside the man in black. "Who are you?" Bellamy hissed, his voice trembling. "To interfere in this family's business." Thaddeus Pike did not look at Bellamy. He looked at Crowley. His voice was cold, flat, and carried across the entire porch. "For all the town to hear, I'm the man who doesn't want his water stolen." The line was drawn. The challenge was made. In that precise moment, as every single person in Bitter Willow was crowded onto the porch, staring at the standoff. Maeve O'Rourke was across the street. She slipped the lock on the bank's side door, the warrant held between her teeth. The bank was dark, silent. She moved by instinct, behind the teller cage, to the vault. The brass key Bellamy carried was for the inner records box. Maeve, however, had her own set of picks. She knelt, her hands working with the same practiced, deft skill that Goldie used on leather. The lock on the main ledger file clicked open. She found the Sutton file. She found the mortgage note. And she found what she was looking for, tucked neatly behind it, a full deed of transfer for the Cotton Draw water rights. It was signed, in a shaky, unfamiliar hand. Goldie Sutton. It was dated that very morning. A forgery. A desperate, arrogant attempt by Crowley to secure the water before the vows. Just in case. Maeve did not hesitate. This was the proof. This was the coercion. She did not copy it. She took it. She folded the document, slid it into her sleeve, relocked the file, and slipped back out into the night. Just another shadow in the chaos. The ride to Winter Range was a climb into silence. They left the raw, yellow lights of bitter willow behind. Ascending a narrow track that Thaddeus seemed to know by instinct, the air grew thinner, colder. The wind, which in the valley had smelled of dust and fear, now smelled of high country pine, crushed wild mint, and the clean metallic bite of the stars themselves. After an hour of hard riding, they crested the final ridge. Goldie saw his home. It was not a ranch house. It was a cabin, a dark, solid shape against the sky. Utterly alone. A single yellow light, warm as butter, glowed in one window. It was the only man-made light for 50 miles, a solitary beacon in a sea of dark, rustling prairie. He led the horses to a small barn, his movements economical in the cold. He unsaddled both animals, fed them, and checked their legs before he acknowledged her. Goldie simply stood, her body thrumming with the adrenaline of the night, the heavy duster he had given her on the ridge now feeling like a lead weight. "There's a basin on the porch," he said, his voice quiet, seeming to respect the immense silence of his own land. "Pump's fresh." He walked ahead, unlocked the cabin door, and went inside, leaving her in the darkness. A moment later, the porch light, a lantern behind smoked glass, flared to life. She saw the basin, a heavy wooden bowl set on a stump. The pump handle was iron, cold to the touch. She pumped, the clank squeak of the mechanism sounding impossibly loud. The water that gushed out was so cold it burned. Goldie leaned over the basin. She untied the thong from her hair, letting the heavy mass of it fall. She cupped the frigid water, splashing it on her face, washing away the dust of the town hall, the sweat of her fear, the lingering, phantom touch of Bellamy's hand. She washed her neck, her arms, her hands, scrubbing until the skin was raw. A tremor started in her shoulders, a deep, rattling cold that came from bone, not skin. Her wet hair clung to her garter, sending rivulets of icy water down her back. She was shaking, not from fear, but from the sudden, total release of tension and the profound, biting cold of the mountain night. She heard a sound on the porch boards. He had come back out, but he was not looking at her. He had turned his back, a gesture of respect so profound it almost made her weep. He was facing the darkness, giving her the privacy of the entire mountain. "There's a towel on the rail," he said, his voice directed at the prairie. "And a dry coat. Leave the wet one." She found them. A rough, clean linen towel and a heavy wool mackinaw. Worn, but clean. She dried her face, her hair, bundling the wet mass of it on top of her head. She stripped off the wet duster, her teeth chattering, and pulled the mackinaw on. It was huge, smelling faintly of wood smoke and sage. She was enveloped, safe. "Thank you," she whispered. He only nodded, still not looking, and pushed the cabin door open for her. "Go in, by the fire." The cabin was one room, but it was not the room she expected. It was Spartan, but impeccably clean. A fire was already blazing in the large stone hearth. A bedroll was laid out neatly in one corner, a table in the other. In the center, a pot-bellied stove radiated a deep, penetrating warmth. The air was dry and hot. He followed her in, closing and barring the heavy door. The sound of the bar sliding into place was a punctuation mark, shutting out the world, shutting out Crowley and Bellamy and the Vows at dusk. "I have soup," he said. It was not an offer, but a statement of fact. He moved to the small stove, ladling a thick bean and bacon soup into 2 tin bowls. He set them on the small, scrubbed pine table, along with 2 spoons. They sat, the table between them, the silence returning. But changed. It was no longer the silence of the mountain. It was the silence of 2 people in one room. Goldie was ravenous. The soup was hot, salty, and real. They ate without speaking. The only sound the scrape of spoons on tin. When she was halfway done, she slowed, the warmth spreading through her. The shaking finally, truly, stopping. He pushed a small tin of biscuits toward her. She reached for one at the same time he reached to adjust the tin. Their hands brushed. It was nothing. The side of his knuckles against the back of her fingers, but it was like flint on steel. A jolt, sharp and white-hot, that made her gasp and pull her hand back as if she'd been burned. He, too, recoiled, his hand dropping to the table as if it were heavy. They looked at each other. The space between them crackled. This was not the accidental press of a body in a storm. This was a deliberate, if accidental, touch, skin on skin, on. "Sorry," she whispered, her voice husky. He just shook his head, his pale eyes fixed on hers, and pushed the tin the rest of the way toward her. She took a biscuit, but her appetite was gone, replaced by a new, strange, and terrifying awareness. Goldie stood, taking her bowl to the dry sink. She felt she had to move, to break the current that flowed between them. She stood by the hearth, her back to him, staring into the flames. "My mother," she said, her voice quiet, almost to herself. "She was the one who taught me the saddle work. My father, he loved the horses, but she understood the leather." Thaddeus had stood as well, but he kept his distance, leaning against the far wall by the stove. He was watching her, his face half in shadow. "She used to say," Goldie continued, her voice growing thick, "that a good stitch was like a good promise. It holds, even when the weight is heavy." She felt a tear slip, hot, down her cheek. She was not crying for the wedding. She was crying for her mother. She told me love wasn't a grand gesture. She said love was just a porch that's strong enough and wide enough to wait out the rain. Her voice broke on the last word. She looked down, ashamed of the tears. Thaddeus moved. He did not go to her. He went to the stove, poured steaming water from a kettle into 2 tin mugs, and dropped a pinch of dried sage into each. He brought one to her, holding it out. She took it, her fingers wrapping around the hot tin. "I buried my wife," he said, his voice a low, rough sound, as if it was being pulled from deep in the earth. "Up on the ridge, 2 years ago. I buried my heart with her. I shoveled the dirt on it myself." Goldie looked up at him, her eyes wide, the tears frozen on her cheeks. He was not looking at the fire. He was looking at her. "But the damnedest thing, Miss Sutton," he said, his voice dropping to a whisper. "I'm standing here tonight, and it seems my heart won't stay in the grave." His confession hung in the air, more real and more tangible than the fire, than the soup, than the bar on the door. It was the truest thing she had ever heard. He did not move away. He stood, his own mug in his hand, not drinking, just watching her. He was close now, close enough for her to feel the heat radiating from his body, a heat different from the fire's. She was not afraid. She was terrified, but not of him. She was terrified of the hope that was, like his heart, refusing to stay buried, slowly, as if it had its own will. Goldie raised her free hand. She did not know what she was doing until it was done. She laid her palm, flat, against the front of his shirt, over his heart. She felt it, under the wool, under the muscle, a solid, strong, steady beat. It was not fast. It was slow and powerful, like the deep rhythm of the earth. It was the beat of a man who was alive, despite his best efforts. He sucked in a sharp breath at her touch. His eyes closed, just for a second. When they opened, the Arctic loneliness was gone, replaced by a raw, burning need that mirrored her own. He set his mug down on the mantel, slowly, as if asking permission with every fractional movement. He raised his hand. His fingers, scarred and calloused from ranch work, were not gentle. They were rough, but they were infinitely tender. He did not touch her face. He touched her wet, tangled hair. He brushed a damp strand back from her temple. Then, his thumb, rough as bark, grazed the high arch of her cheekbone, wiping away the track of her tear. It was a question. Goldie gave him the answer. She did not speak. She rose up on her toes, just an inch, leaning into his touch. It was all he needed. The kiss, when it came, was not a collision. It was a landing. It was a slow, warm, and certain press of his mouth to hers. It was not the desperate, frantic kiss of a first passion. It was the kiss of two survivors, of two people who had forgotten what warmth felt like. It was a kiss that tasted of wood smoke and sage tea, and of the salt of her tears. It was a kiss that held no lies. She made a small sound in the back of her throat, a sound of homecoming, and her hand moved from his chest, her arms circling his neck, her fingers tangling in the thick hair at his nape. She pressed herself against him, seeking his solidity, his strength. He answered. His arms, which had been at his sides, came around her. He held her, not in a crushing embrace, not in a grip of possession. He held her with a strength that was, at its core, gentle. It was the embrace of a man who knew how to hold, but who also knew how to let go. His one hand splayed across her back, pulling her flush against him, while the other cradled the back of her head, holding her steady as the kiss deepened. It was not a chaste kiss. It was deep and slow and hungry. It was a silent, desperate conversation, but it was not hurried. There was nowhere to be. The world was barred outside. When they finally broke for air, they were both breathless. He did not release her. He rested his forehead against hers. Their breath mingled, clouding in the cool air near the fire. "Goldie," he whispered. It was the first time she had heard him say her name. He guided her, his arm still firmly around her waist, to the small wooden settee that faced the fire. They sat, not beside each other, but together, Goldie turning, tucking her legs beneath her, leaning into his side. He wrapped both arms around her, pulling her close against his chest. She rested her head in the hollow of his shoulder. He rested his chin on the top of her damp hair. The fire popped, a log settling, sending a shower of sparks up the chimney. The orange light flickered over their faces, their hands. It lit the warm skin of her throat, the strong line of his jaw. The wind howled outside, a high, lonely sound. But inside, there was only the sound of the fire and the dual rhythm of two hearts, finally beating in time. He held her. She let herself be held. They did not speak again for a long, long time. There were no more words. There were just slow, gentle kisses pressed into her hair, the feel of his thumb stroking her arm, the absolute, unshakable certainty of the safe, warm circle of his arms. It was not a prelude. It was the destination. It was the porch, and the rain was finally, for tonight, held at bay. The intimacy of the night evaporated with the first cold, gray light of dawn. There was no transition, no lingering warmth. The world returned, hard and sharp. Goldie woke on the settee, covered in the mackinaw, the fire a pile of gray embers. Thaddeus was already by the door, pulling a cinch tight on his gray gelding. He had not slept. Goldie stood, her body stiff, but her mind clear. The fog of fear was gone, replaced by a cold, sharp-edged clarity. She handed him the mackinaw. He took it without a word, his eyes asking the question. She answered by walking to her own mare. She picked up her saddle and, beside it, the tool belt she had worn to the dance. She strapped it around her waist. The weight of the leather and the cold steel of her tools settled on her hips. It was her armor. It was her identity. Thaddeus watched her, a flicker of something respect, understanding passing through his guarded eyes. Maeve O'Rourke met them in the shadow of a basalt cliff, a mile outside of town. The deputy's face was grim, her eyes red from lack of sleep. She carried a shotgun in her saddle scabbard and the forged transfer deed in her vest pocket. "The pipes," Maeve said, her voice a low rasp. "They were delivered 2 days ago. They're not at the railhead. They're at the old millstone depot, west of town. Bellamy's leased it. He's not waiting for the Vows." Goldie said, "He's confident," Maeve replied. "Let's make him regret that." The three riders moved as one, cutting across the prairie as the sun began to burn the mist off the grass. The millstone depot was a collection of sagging tin roofs and weathered plank buildings, smelling of old grain dust and rodent droppings, but stacked high in the main yard, gleaming in the new morning light, were sections of galvanized steel pipe, dozens of them, enough to divert a river. They dismounted, moving low and fast. Thaddeus took the perimeter. a shadow moving between the buildings, his gaze scanning the ridge. Maeve and Goldie went straight for the depot office, a small shack with a single, dirty window. The door was locked. Goldie didn't hesitate. She pulled a thin steel pick from her tool belt and worked the lock. It clicked open in under 10 seconds. Her mother had taught her that. 2. The office was chaos. Crates, ledgers, and maps. Goldie's eyes went straight to the shipping manifests tacked to the wall. The top sheets were all identical. H. Bellamy, Millstone Depot. "This is nothing?" Maeve muttered, shuffling through papers on the desk. "Wait," Goldie said. She ripped the top sheet off the tack, and the one below it, and the one below that. Tucked at the very bottom, written in a different hand, was a freight manifest. The carbon copy, the ink was faint, purple. "Consignee H. Bellamy, destination." Goldie's finger traced the line. It did not say Millstone Depot. It said, "Winter Range, North Gate. That's my headwater," Thaddeus said from the doorway. He had entered without a sound. His voice was deathly quiet. That's the source. It was the proof. He was not just taking the water from the Sutton land. He was cutting it off at the mountain, stealing it from Thaddeus first, drying out the entire valley in one move. "We have his intent," Maeve said, her voice tight with a cold, legal fury. "We need to link him to the bank," Goldie said. Her eyes scanned the room. On the desk, near a half-empty bottle of whiskey, sat a small, steel cash box. It was locked, but on the dusty tin lid, there was a faint, greasy outline, an impression. "Maeve, your lamp," Goldie ordered. Maeve handed her the small chimney lamp from the wall. Goldie carefully removed the glass, her skilled fingers steady. She scraped the inside of the glass, gathering a fine black powder of soot onto a piece of paper. She returned to the cash box. Holding her breath, she gently, expertly, dusted the black soot over the greasy impression. The image resolved, stark and clear. It was the print of a key, not a simple lockbox key. It was ornate, double-bitted. "That's it," Maeve whispered, her eyes wide. "That's the key I saw on his vest, the bank's records vault." Goldie took a clean sheet of paper from a ledger, warmed it slightly with her breath, and pressed it onto the dusted print. The image transferred perfectly, proof that the man using this office, the man ordering these pipes, had access to the bank's forged documents. A throat cleared behind them. "You folks finding what you need?" They spun. An old man stood in the doorway, a half-eaten apple in one hand, his suspenders stained with tobacco. He was the depot guard, ancient and unconcerned. Maeve stepped forward, her hand casually resting near her badge. "Morning, Pops. Just checking on Mr. Bellamy's permits. Seems to be a lot of activity." The old man chuckled, gumming his apple. "Activity that ain't the half of it. Man's in a hurry. Mr. Crowley hisself was out here yesterday, checking on these pipes." Maeve's eyes lit up. "Oh, Mr. Crowley." "Yep, riding both these men hard. Bellamy and him, I told me. Seems like a powerful lot of work for a patch of land that ain't even yours yet." "You know what Mr. Crowley told me?" "What's that?" Maeve asked, her voice calm. "He said," the old man leaned in, enjoying the gossip. "He said, 'Don't you worry your head. Old-timer, there's a wedding on Sunday. That's gonna fix everything, make it all legal and tidy.'" Maeve smiled, a thin, sharp smile. "Would you be willing to sign a statement saying that, sir, for the territorial record?" They rode back not the way they came, but through Sparrow Notch, a narrow, fast-running cut through the foothills. They had the evidence, the forged deed, the false manifest, the key print, and a signed witness statement proving the wedding was a tool of coercion. They were halfway through the notch, the rock walls rising sheer on both sides, when the first shot cracked the morning air. It wasn't aimed at them. The bullet exploded on the granite wall 10 feet in front of Thaddeus's horse, sending a shower of stone chips and lead spattering the air. The gray gelding screamed and reared. "Ambush!" Maeve yelled, pulling her shotgun. 2 men, the same 2 from the alley, stepped out from the rocks above them, rifles leveled. "The satchel! Miss Sutton!" one of them yelled. "Crowley wants the papers, and he wants the girl. He's tired of games." They were trapped. The pass was too narrow to turn. Thaddeus fought his horse, his face a mask of cold rage, calculating the odds. Goldie didn't wait. She didn't panic. She drew the small revolver Maeve had pressed into her hand. She ignored the men. She aimed high up, at a massive, precariously balanced shelf of shale rock directly above the ambushers. She fired once. The shot was deafening in the enclosed space. The bullet hit the rock, and the result was more than she could have hoped for. It didn't just spark. It shattered the unstable ledge. A ton of loose rock and shale cascaded down. It didn't hit the men, but it landed directly on the path in front of them, a curtain of noise and dust. The gunmen's own horses, tethered nearby, shrieked in terror and bolted, stampeding back down the pass, creating a moving wall of panic. "Now!" Thaddeus bellowed. He spurred his gray gelding forward, straight into the dust cloud. A second shot rang out, wild. From the confusion, they burst through the dust, thundering past the scrambling, cursing men, and out into the open prairie. They did not slow for a mile. When they finally pulled to a heaving, gasping stop, Goldie saw it. Thaddeus was sitting upright, but his left side was dark. His black shirt was blacker, wet. "You're hit," she said, her voice flat. "It's a graze," he gritted out, but his face was pale. The bullet had torn through the thick muscle of his shoulder. She was off her horse in an instant, pulling him from the saddle. He stumbled, leaning his weight on her. She eased him to the ground. "Hold this," she commanded, pressing his own hand to the wound. She turned, her back to him, and ripped the hem of her blue cotton dress. The fabric wouldn't tear. She cursed, pulling a skinning knife from her tool belt. She didn't just cut a strip. She sliced a long, wide bandage from her own skirt. She packed it against the wound, her hands strong, impersonal, and sure. He winced as she applied pressure, her knuckles white. "It'll hold," she said, her voice a low growl. She tied the knot with a vicious yank. He looked up at her. Her hair was wild, her face smudged with soot and streaked with dust. Her eyes, fixed on the wound, were not the eyes of the woman he had held last night. They were the color of blue steel. They got the evidence to Judge Hollister in Milltown by 2 o'clock. He was an old man with a face like dried leather, and he despised Silas Crowley. He read the documents, his fingers tapping. The forged deed, the manifest, the guard statement. "He's using a wedding vow as a tool of extortion," Hollister snapped, his voice like dry sticks breaking. "He's forcing the voluntary signature Thaddeus told you about. If you do not say, 'I do' of your own free will, Miss Sutton, this entire transaction is an act of coercion. It is fraud. It is theft." He grabbed his pen, dipped it, and signed a heavy parchment with a flourish. "This is an injunction, a temporary order to halt the marriage. Pending a full hearing, any attempt to proceed will be met with arrest." He handed it to the local marshal. "Serve this, now." Maeve, Thaddeus, and Goldie watched from the window as the marshal folded the paper, put it in his pocket, and walked to the saloon. "He's not going," Maeve whispered, a sick feeling in her stomach. "He's been bought. He'll have a drink. He'll take the long road. He'll get lost until after the vows." Goldie looked at the town clock. It was 3 in the afternoon. "The wedding," she said, her voice hollow, "is in 3 hours. They had won the law, but they had lost the time. "We can ride," Thaddeus said, his voice low, his hand on his wounded shoulder. "We can ride back to Winter Range. He won't find you. I won't let him." Goldie looked at him, at the man who was willing to bleed for her. Then she looked at her own hands, stained with soot and his blood. "No," she said. She turned and walked back toward her horse. "They want a public wedding," she said, pulling herself into the saddle. "Crowley said it would fix everything. He needs the town to see me agree." She looked down at Maeve and Thaddeus, her shadow falling long over them in the afternoon sun. "I'm not running. I'm going to the church. I'm going to give them the answer they deserve, right in front of God and everyone else." The long, resonant toll of the St. Brigid's bell vibrated in the heavy air, a sound less of celebration than of finality. The church was packed, every pew filled with the hopeful, the curious, and the coerced. They had come to witness the sealing of the valley's fate, disguised as the union of its most unfortunate daughter and its most ambitious son. Goldie O'Brien stood at the back of the aisle, the scent of old wax and incense filling her lungs. She moved against the grain of expectation. There was no white lace, no silk imported from the East. She wore a simple dress of pale blue muslin, the stitches neat and strong, sewn by her own hand in the small hours of the morning. She wore no veil to hide her face or blur her vision. She would see this through clearly. At the altar, Bellamy Thorne smiled, a brilliant, practiced expression of eager devotion. He looked immaculate in a black suit, a white rosebud in his lapel, but the smile was a mask. It never touched the cold calculation in his eyes. Beside him, in the front pew, sat Crowley. He was not a guest. He was an overseer. He sat rigid as a block of granite, his stillness a palpable force, sucking the warmth from the air around him. And then Goldie saw him. He was not in a pew. He was part of the shadows near the back, leaning against one of the thick stone pillars that held the roof aloft. Thaddeus Hale. His long black coat was draped over his frame, and beneath it, she could see the stark white slash of a bandage against his dark shirt. Covering his shoulder, he looked tired, bruised from their last encounter with Crowley's men. But he was here. He did not look at Bellamy. He did not look at the priest. He looked only at her. His eyes were dark, steady, and held a promise that shattered the sanctity of the ceremony. His gaze was not a plea to run. It was not a judgment. It was a simple, profound statement of fact. If you say yes, I am still here. If you say no, I am here also. He was a fixed point in her swirling, terrifying world. That silent vow, passed across the crowded room, was the only blessing she needed. She took a breath and began her walk. She walked alone. The organ music swelled, a triumphant sound that felt like a mockery. Every eye was on her. She felt their pity, their resentment, their fear. They saw a lamb. They did not see the iron in her spine, forged in the grief of her father's death and tempered by the truth she now carried. She reached the altar. Bellamy took her hand. His skin was smooth and cold, like a polished stone. She did not tremble. She simply waited. Father Michael, a man whose spiritual myopia served him well in this town, cleared his throat and began. His voice droned, reciting the familiar words that had bound generations. The air in the church became too thick to breathe. The light from the stained glass windows painted them in jewels of red and blue, a holy light on an unholy proceeding. And do you, Goldie O'Brien, take this man, Bellamy Thorne, to be your lawfully wedded husband, to have and to hold, from this day forward, in sickness and in health, for richer, for poorer. Goldie looked past the priest, past her intended, and met the cold, assessing stare of Crowley. He was watching her, daring her to fold. Do you go to this union willingly and of your own accord? The silence that followed was absolute. It stretched, thin and brittle, until it seemed the very stones of the church would crack. Bellamy's smile tightened. He squeezed her hand. A silent, painful command. Goldie turned her head slightly, just enough to look directly at him. She pulled her hand from his grasp. Her voice was not a shout, not a whisper, but it was as clear and sharp as breaking glass. No, it was not a gasp. It was a single, collective intake of air from 200 lungs, followed by an explosion of sound. Whispers erupted, a sound like dry leaves skittering across the stone floor. Bellamy's face, a moment ago so full of triumph, crumpled into disbelief. What? He hissed. Crowley's hand lifted, just an inch, a subtle gesture to the men he had placed among the congregation. He was shutting down the disturbance before it could ignite, but the disturbance was already in motion. This wedding cannot proceed, the voice came from the center aisle. The crowd parted, murmuring and turning. Maeve Callahan strode forward, her face set. She looked as out of place in a church as a hawk in a chicken coop, and she carried a sheaf of papers like a weapon. "What is the meaning of this?" Bellamy demanded, his voice rising in panic. He tried to reclaim his role as the wronged groom. "Maeve, you are disrupting a holy sacrament. This is no sacrament. Bellamy, it is fraud." Maeve stopped 10 feet from the altar, her voice ringing with an authority that silenced the pews. She held up the first paper. "This is a court order, signed by Judge Hollister this very morning, invalidating the lien against the O'Brien property. The debt was a fabrication." Bellamy went pale, a sickly, grayish white. "This is madness. That lien is legal." It was, until we found this. Maeve held up the second document, a thin stack of papers. "This is a copy of your father's hidden ledger, showing the systematic theft of water rights across this valley for the last 15 years, including the falsified loan to Goldie's father." A deeper, more angry murmur rippled through the crowd. These were people whose wells had run low, whose crops had withered. "And this," Maeve said, her voice dropping, thick with contempt as she held up a small, dark photograph, "is the proof of your personal involvement. A photograph from the forge, taken last week. It shows the ink smudge from a key, your office key, Bellamy, matching the identical, forged signature on the original O'Brien lien document." Bellamy staggered, as if struck. Lies, slander. "This woman she's unstable, she's obsessed." He turned to Goldie, his eyes desperate, grabbing for her arm. "Goldie, tell them this is madness. Tell them you want this." Goldie stepped away from him, moving to stand beside Maeve. She faced the people of her town, the people who had been whispering about her for weeks. "He is lying," she said. Her voice was steady. "It was never about the land. It was never about the debt. He never wanted me. He wanted the water beneath my land." She explained it all, her words clear and precise. She spoke of the pipeline, burrowing in secret through the hills for the last 6 months. She spoke of the plan to divert the high spring, the one that fed the entire valley, away from the farms and straight to the railroad depot, to be sold for a fortune. "The shipping labels," Goldie continued, her voice gaining strength. "The crates marked mining equipment that Thaddeus Hale found. They were pipes. They were pumps. They were the tools he needed to steal our future." She pointed a finger first at Bellamy, then at Crowley, and he knew, they both knew, that my father's original deed stipulated that the water rights, the true power of this valley, could only be controlled by a female heir, or her husband. The final piece clicked into place. The church erupted. This was not a marriage. It was an acquisition. The chaos broke. A man in the third pew, a man with dull eyes and a poorly fitting suit who had looked bored until this very second, suddenly moved. He was one of Crowley's. He was not trying to silence Goldie. He was trying to get the evidence. His hand moved toward the inside of his jacket, aiming for Maeve. Gun Thaddeus's voice was a harsh roar. He was no longer in the shadows. He was a blur of black wool. Launching himself from the pillar, he was moving before the man's fingers even touched the metal. He crossed the space in 3 massive strides, ignoring the pews, ignoring the screaming guests. A white-hot spike of agony lanced from his bad shoulder as he collided with the man, a brutal, driving tackle that sent them both crashing into the center aisle. The man was strong, fighting to bring the weapon free. Thaddeus didn't try to hit him. He wrapped both arms around the man's torso, his good shoulder driving into the man's sternum, his left hand gripping the man's right wrist, pinning the gun in its holster. They hit the aisle with a sickening thud. The crowd surged back. Bellamy cowered near the altar. Goldie rushed forward. The heavy thud of a revolver on the stone flags cut through the noise. It had been knocked free, skittering across the floor and coming to rest near the baptismal font. Thaddeus's forearm was across the man's throat, pinning him to the floor. He was breathing hard, the pain in his shoulder radiating down his entire side, but he did not look at the man he held down. He looked up, his gaze finding Goldie through the chaos. "Are you safe?" he breathed. Before she could answer, the heavy sacristy door at the side of the altar grated open. Judge Hollister emerged, his face a thundercloud. He was not in his robes, but his authority needed no costume. Maeve, it was clear, had not come alone. "This proceeding is over," Hollister's voice boomed, cutting through the panic. The town marshal and 2 deputies followed him in, weapons drawn but held low. Hollister pointed to the man struggling under Thaddeus. "That man is under arrest for carrying a concealed weapon in a place of worship and attempted assault. Get him out of here." The deputies hauled the man to his feet. Thaddeus rose slowly, clutching his injured shoulder, his eyes never leaving Goldie. Hollister then turned his righteous glare on the altar. "Mr. Thorne, the marriage contract is nullified, based on clear and present evidence of coercion, conspiracy, and significant financial fraud." Bellamy looked at Goldie, not with anger, but with the hollow, empty gaze of a gambler who has lost the final hand. He was a ruin, a hollowed-out man. He looked to the front pew, his eyes pleading. Crowley had not moved. He had watched the tackle, the gun, the arrest, with the detached interest of a man watching a middling stage play. Now, he rose slowly from the pew. He carefully brushed a speck of dust from his sleeve. He began to applaud, a slow, soft, methodical clap that echoed unnervingly in the violated sanctuary. "Bravo," Crowley said, his voice quiet but carrying to every corner. "Bravo, Miss O'Brien. A fine piece of theater. Truly." He walked past the deputies, past the judge, and stopped in the center of the aisle. He looked at Goldie, and at Thaddeus, who now stood beside her. "You have your paper." "Judge," Crowley said, nodding to Hollister, "you have your laws. And you," he said to Maeve, "have your righteous anger. It is all very moving." A cold smile touched his lips. It was the smile of a snake assessing its prey. "But the water," he said, "the water flows where the pipe tells it to. Your court order cannot move a mountain spring, and my men have been working all night. By morning, the spring will be dry." He nodded, a gesture of finality. "Enjoy your victory." He turned and walked down the aisle. The crowd parted for him as if he were a leper. His footsteps echoed, the only sound in the stunned silence. He did not look back. The victory, so absolute a moment ago, evaporated. Bellamy was broken. The lean was gone, but the threat was more real than ever. Thaddeus moved to Goldie's side, his hand hovering near her elbow, not touching, but present. He ignored the pain in his shoulder. He looked at her, and she looked back at him. The crowd, the judge, the deputies, they all faded away. She saw the truth in his eyes. He saw the resolve in hers. This was not the end. This was the intermission. The legal battle was won. The physical battle, the one for the water itself, had just begun. Crowley was right. A piece of paper could not stop a crew of armed men. They had to hold the headwaters, and they had to hold them tonight. The church bells were still a faint, sour echo in their ears when the rider found them. He was breathless, his horse lathered, skidding to a halt outside the town hall just as Judge Hollister was formally taking Bellamy's statement. The news was a punch to the gut. Crowley had not waited. He was already moving. His crews were hauling the main pipe sections through Cutthroat Pass, using the cover of night, intending to have the diversion dammed and the water flowing away from the valley by sunrise. The small, sharp victory in the church evaporated, replaced by the cold, thin air of reality. Goldie, Thaddeus, and Maeve gathered by the livery stables, the adrenaline of the confrontation draining away, leaving only exhaustion and a stark, new fear. "He'll have 20, maybe 30 men," Maeve said, her voice practical, checking the load in her rifle. "We are 3, not 3, Thaddeus said. He moved stiffly, his voice tight with the pain from his shoulder as he cinched the saddle on Smoky Gray. Crowley made enemies of more than just farmers, the boys at the Blue Thistle camp. They owe him no love. They fear him, but they hate him more. He looked at Maeve. They might not fight for us, but they will sure as hell help us move some horses. The plan was desperate, formed in the chilling dusk as they rode out of town. They were not aiming for a gunfight. They did not need to defeat Crowley's men. They only needed to defeat his timeline. They just had to stop the pipes. The high country was a world of black stone and silver moonlight. The air was thin, cold, and smelled of pine and impending frost. They rode hard, Thaddeus favoring his left side, Goldie keeping pace on her mare, her heart a frantic drum against her ribs. Maeve rode like a phantom, her face set and unreadable. They reached the overlook above Cutthroat Pass just before midnight. Below them, the scene was a violation of the quiet dark. A long train of heavy wagons, at least 15 of them, was grinding its way up the narrowest part of the pass. They were hauled by straining mule teams, each wagon bearing a massive, dark iron pipe, gleaming wetly in the torchlight. The orange flames cast demonic, dancing shadows on the canyon walls. Men shouted commands, their voices echoing flatly, and at the front, unmistakable on his black gelding, Crowley himself directed the operation, a general conquering a new territory. "They are almost at the Narrows," Thaddeus whispered, his breath a white plume. He turned to Goldie, his eyes dark in the moonlight. "The Blue Thistle boys are in position. They'll drive the horses to block the pass entrance. That chaos is Maeve's signal." "Goldie, you have to get to the wagons on the incline. The pipes are chained down, but they're linked by coupling pins. If you can get under and pull those pins, gravity will do the rest." "How?" she asked, her voice small, her hands numb on the storm lantern she carried. "They will be looking up at the stampede. They will be looking across at Maeve. They will not be looking for someone under the wagons." She swallowed, the cold air burning her throat, and nodded. This was it. Thaddeus raised his good arm and gave a low, piercing whistle, the sound of a hawk, cutting the night. It was the signal. From the ridge opposite, Goldie raised the lantern. She opened the shutter, let the light flash once, twice, a third time. 3 sharp, distinct pulses of light, disappearing into the vast darkness. For a second, there was only silence, the grinding of the wagon wheels, the curses of the mule drivers. Then the silence was broken. It was not a sound, at first, but a vibration. It came through the soles of their boots, a deep, terrestrial rumble that grew and grew until it became the sound of a falling mountain. The ground itself began to shake. "Now," Thaddeus said. A wave of dark shapes poured over the northern ridge. It was a torrent of animal muscle. 200 horses, maybe more, driven hard by the Blue Thistle cowboys. A living avalanche aimed directly at the mouth of the pass. Dust rose in a silver cloud, catching the moonlight, obscuring the stars. "Stampede!" The cry went up from below. Crowley's men shouted in confusion. The mule teams brayed in terror, pulling against their harnesses, throwing the wagon train into chaos. The lead wagons ground to a halt, blocked by the wall of panicked horses. A single shot cracked through the air, echoing from the south wall of the pass. "Crack!" Maeve fired again, aiming high into the rock. The muzzle flashed a bright yellow star. She was drawing their attention, making them think they were being flanked by riflemen. "Over here, you cowards," she yelled, her voice carrying clear. In that manufactured chaos, Goldie moved. She slid from her horse and ran, hunched low, using the deep shadows of the boulders. The guards were all looking up, their rifles pointed toward Maeve's position or scrambling to control the terrified mules. Goldie slipped between 2 of the heavy wagons, the air hot and stinking of axle grease and animal sweat. She was in the belly of the beast. She crawled beneath the wagon bed Thaddeus had pointed out, the last one on the steepest part of the incline. Above her, boots thumped on the wooden planks. Men were shouting. She could feel the vibration of their panic. The huge pipe was resting on heavy wooden beams. She saw the coupling, a simple, massive iron pin, holding it to the section on the wagon behind it. She reached for it. It was thick, heavy, and slick with grease. She pulled. It would not budge. The immense weight of the pipe section behind it held it fast. She braced her feet against the heavy axle, pushed her back against the cold rock of the pass wall, and wrapped both hands around the pin's handle. She pulled, using every ounce of her strength. The iron pin scraped, groaned with protest, and then slid free. The pipe behind her shifted with a heavy, Sickening thunk. She scrambled to the next coupling. She pulled the second pin. A deep, groaning rumble started. The 20-foot section of iron, weighing thousands of pounds, began to slide. It broke the chain holding it to the wagon bed. It crashed onto the rocky trail. And then, slowly at first, it began to roll. It gathered speed, struck a boulder, and launched into the deep ravine. The sound of it crashing on the rocks below echoed like a cannon shot. "What was that?" a guard shouted. Somewhere above her. Goldie did not wait. She scrambled to the next wagon. Crawling on her hands and knees in the dirt, she pulled the pins. Another section broke free, and another, one after another. The iron vertebrae of Crowley's great snake were breaking apart, tumbling into the gorge, destroyed. Above. Thaddeus rode Smoky Gray not with the stampede, but along the cliff edge, watching the escorts. He saw two of Crowley's men break away from the confusion. They were not riding toward the horses. They were riding hard toward the dry brush on the valley floor below the pass. One of them held a dark, heavy bundle. Thaddeus knew, with chilling certainty, what it was. This was not just sabotage. This was scorched earth. He spurred Smoky Gray, taking a dangerous, near-vertical path down the rock face, the horse moving with impossible, goat-like agility. He intercepted them just as the man was unwrapping the bundle. Blasting caps and a torch. They were going to set the entire prairie ablaze, a wall of fire to trap the blue thistle riders and their horses. "Hail," the man yelled, dropping the torch and fumbling for his pistol. Thaddeus did not slow down. He came in hard. His boot lashed out. Kicking the gun from the man's hand, he leaned low from the saddle, a white-hot spike of agony lancing from his wounded shoulder, and swept the bundle of blasting caps from the man's grasp. He rode past them without stopping, hurling the explosives into the deepest part of the ravine, where they were swallowed by the darkness. "Light the fire." Light it now. Crowley's voice was a scream of pure rage, audible even over the horses and the crashing metal. He had seen Goldie. He had seen the sabotage. A different man, one closer to the wagons, obeyed. He lit a spare torch and threw it into a thicket of dry manzanita. The brush ignited instantly. A wall of orange flame roared to life, 20 feet high in a second. But the high country weather was fickle. A sudden, violent downdraft swept through the narrow pass. The wind, which had been blowing north, suddenly turned, whipping back on itself. It grabbed the flames and hurled them back, not toward the prairie, but straight at the wagon train. The wagons, a man shrieked. The powder wagon, the dry canvas cover of the lead wagon, the one carrying the tools and the black powder for blasting, caught a spark. Goldie, emerging from under the last wagon, saw it. The entire convoy, the men, the mules, were about to be blown apart. She saw a heavy canvas tarp folded on the ground, a spare wagon cover. She ran to the nearest water barrel on the side of a wagon, tipped it, and soaked the heavy cloth. The weight nearly pulled her down. She ran straight at the burning wagon, the heat scorching her face and stinging her eyes. With a desperate heave, she threw the heavy, wet blanket over the burning wheel and the edge of the wagon bed. The flames hissed, sputtered, and died, replaced by a thick, acrid cloud of smoke. She turned, coughing, her eyes streaming, just as a sharp, echoing crack sounded from above. It was not a gunshot. It was wood. The fire, before she'd smothered it, had weakened the roots of an old ponderosa pine on the cliff edge. It fell. The massive tree crashed down onto the trail right behind her. A curtain of needles and splintered wood. It blocked the pass completely. It cut her off from Thaddeus and Maeve. She was trapped between the smoldering wagon train and the wreckage. Thaddeus saw her. He was off Smoky Gray in an instant, running toward the barrier. Goldie. He reached the tangle of branches. The trunk was massive, a solid wall of wood. He saw a long iron crowbar lying near the wagon, dropped by one of the fleeing workers. He grabbed it, jammed the tip under the trunk, and shoved it deep. "Thaddeus, your shoulder," she cried, seeing the dark, glistening stain of fresh blood that now soaked his entire shirt. He ignored her, setting his boots in the dirt, his face pale and slick with sweat and pain. He put his entire weight on the bar. The tree groaned, but did not move. Goldie scrambled over the smaller branches, reaching him. She gripped the iron bar just below his hands, her knuckles brushing his. She set her shoulder next to his. Together. He grunted, his voice strained. She looked at him. His face was inches from hers, illuminated in the flickering, dying firelight. His eyes were dark, intense, stripped of all pretense, all shadows. In that moment, surrounded by smoke and danger, there was no past, there was no pain, there was only this, a complete, total, unbreakable trust. He saw her strength. She saw his sacrifice. Now, she said, they heaved, their muscles screamed. The combined effort, the perfect synchronization of their strength, was just enough. The trunk shifted, scraped against the rock, and rolled 2 feet, opening a gap just wide enough to pass, and then the sky opened. It was not a drizzle. It was a deluge, a cold, sudden, unseasonal torrent of rain that swept through the pass as if a dam had broken in the heavens. It was as if the mountain itself was intervening. The rain hit the fire with a deafening, final hiss, turning the world to steam and mud. The remaining embers were extinguished in seconds. The rain turned the ravine into a river, the dry bed of the cotton draw, which had not seen water in months, roared to life. The water, channeled by the narrow rock walls, became a furious, churning brown torrent. Down in the gorge, the scattered, priceless iron pipes were lifted by the flash flood. They were slammed against the rock walls, the sound of their destruction echoing up the pass. A deep, resonant, metallic clang, 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 like the tolling of giant, broken bells. It was the sound of Crowley's ambition, shattered. The wagon train was a wreck. The horses were scattered. The pipes were gone. Crowley stood alone in the mud and the driving rain, his fine coat ruined, his face blank with shock. His men were already vanishing into the darkness, abandoning their defeated master. He turned to retreat, to salvage something, anything. But a figure blocked his path. Maeve Callahan stood there, her rifle held steady, her face impassive in the downpour. Going somewhere. Crowley. He lunged at her, a final, desperate burst of animal rage. She did not flinch. She simply stepped aside, letting his momentum carry him past, and brought the heavy wooden butt of her rifle down hard across his back. He collapsed to his knees in the mud. She pulled his hands behind him and snapped the iron handcuffs onto his wrists. "James Crowley," Maeve said, her voice cold and formal, louder than the storm. "You are under arrest for attempted arson, for the deliberate obstruction of a public water source, and for conspiracy to commit coercion and fraud." He looked up, his face a mask of mud and hatred. He opened his mouth and let out a raw, wordless cry of fury and defeat. The rain hammered down. The night, the wind, and the roaring water swallowed the sound completely. It was as if he had made no noise at all, just another animal, lost and defeated in the storm. The sun rose on a world washed clean. The rain had passed just before dawn, leaving the air sharp and cold, smelling of wet sage and pine. The mud in the pass was deep, but in the valley, the cotton draw was singing. It was a sound Bitter Willow had not heard in a long time, a full, rushing music that promised life. They gathered not at the church or the town hall, but at the head of the draw, on the damp earth beside the newly full stream. It was not a formal summons, but the whole town came. They stood in small, quiet groups, farmers in their Sunday best, ranchers twisting their hats in their hands. The women of the town gathered, watching. Judge Hollister was there, along with the marshal. Maeve Callahan stood near the bank, her arms crossed, her gaze sweeping over the crowd. She had brought Crowley in just an hour after sunup, caked in mud and shackled, and locked him in the town jail to await the federal transport. Goldie and Thaddeus arrived together. A quiet murmur went through the crowd. She was not in her borrowed blue dress from the wedding that wasn't, but in her practical split skirt and shirt. Thaddeus walked beside her, his left arm in a fresh sling, his face bruised but his eyes clear. Goldie did not address the crowd. She walked to a large, flat-topped boulder near the water's edge, the one her father had always called the Treaty Stone. She unrolled the original, brittle document of her family's water rights. The paper was stiff, the ink faded, but the line of her ancestor's signature, Eliza Sutton, was still visible. Judge Hollister stepped forward, carrying his heavy ledger and his official seal. He did not make a grand speech. He simply opened his book. "The legal chicanery that plagued this valley is at an end," he said, his voice carrying over the sound of the water. "The lien against the winter range is expunged from the record. The charges against Mr. Hale are dismissed with prejudice. The former property of Bellamy Thorne is seized by the county to pay his fines and restitution." He dipped his pen in a pot of fresh black ink. "But most importantly, we must reaffirm the founding principle of this valley, the water." He looked at Goldie, who nodded once. Hollister laid a new, blank addendum beside the old deed. He began to write, his pen scratching firmly. When he was done, he read the words aloud. "By the authority of this court and the laws of the territory, the claim is clarified and restored. The primary rights to the high spring and the cotton draw are affirmed, now and forever, to the property known as the Winter Range, under the stewardship of its legal heir, Goldie Sutton." He looked up, meeting the eyes of the townsfolk. "And let this addendum be clear to all." He read the last line, his voice rising. "These rights, and the water they govern, may only be signed away, shared, or otherwise encumbered by Goldie Sutton and a spouse of her own free and voluntary choosing. No other claim shall be recognized." He stamped the paper with the heavy seal of the court. The sound was a dull, satisfying thud. A collective breath was released. It was over. Goldie left the paper on the rock, a public declaration. She turned to the crowd, to her neighbors, an old rancher, Jeb Hemlock, who had been openly hostile to her at the Mercantile. Stepped forward. He cleared his throat, his eyes on the ground. "Miss Sutton, that pipeline, it tore up the north pasture something fierce. We got maybe 10 hands. We'd be honored to lend 'em, to help you dig a proper communal irrigation ditch, one that serves all of us." "Fair. I've got 2 strong sons." Another man called out. "They'll be here tomorrow, 6 in the morning. Then a young woman, Mrs. Davies, who held a small girl by the hand, pushed her way to the front. Her face was earnest. 'Miss Goldie, I heard you're the finest leather worker in this county. I know it's not proper, but my daughter, Clara, she's got a steady hand. I was wondering, would you ever take on an apprentice?" Goldie looked at the small girl, who was staring at her with wide, awestruck eyes. A slow, genuine smile spread across Goldie's face, the first in what felt like a lifetime. "I think," she said, her voice a little thick, "I think I'd like that very much." It was a start. Not a solution, but a beginning. The day was spent in settling the wreckage. They watched from the post office steps as Bellamy Thorne, carrying a single, pathetic carpet bag, was put on the afternoon stage. He had not been jailed. His power stripped away. Was punishment enough? He was a ghost, fined into poverty and banished from the town he had tried to strangle. He did not look at anyone as he left. Later, 2 federal marshals arrived on horseback. They took custody of Crowley. He was no longer the composed puppet master. He was silent, his eyes burning with a cold, contained hatred that promised he would not forget. As they led him to his horse, he stopped and looked at Goldie and Thaddeus, who stood across the street. "This is not over," he spat. "It is here," Thaddeus replied, his voice flat. They watched until the marshals and their prisoner were a small speck on the road to Helena, where a federal trial for conspiracy, attempted arson, and a dozen other charges awaited him. As they turned to go, Goldie saw the postmaster come out and, with a small grunt of satisfaction, tear the yellowed notice of the marriage for debt from the community board. He tore it into 4 pieces and dropped it into the mud. They rode back to the winter range as the shadows grew long. The air was peaceful, The ranch was quiet. The only sound, the sigh of the wind through the pines. There was mud on the porch, a broken window from their last fight with Crowley's men, and a feeling of stillness, of a place holding its breath. They worked together, wordlessly. Thaddeus, despite his arm, was strong enough to right the overturned water trough. Goldie swept the mud and broken glass from the porch. They were not talking about the future. They were not talking about the past. They were just being. As Thaddeus was rehanging the heavy barn door, which had been torn from one hinge, Goldie returned from the forge. She was holding something. It was a length of twisted, dark metal, with several small, flat iron pendants hanging from it. "What's that?" he asked, wiping sweat from his forehead with his good arm. "I made it a while ago." She said, a little shy, "From the tines of an old broken pitchfork. I was waiting." She hung it from a nail on the porch eave. The evening breeze caught it, and the small pieces of iron touched. It was not a high, sweet chime. It was a low, resonant, intermittent sound, like a small, private laugh. "It fits," he said, his voice quiet. They ate a simple meal of bread and beans as the sky turned a deep, bruised purple and gold. The work was done. The quiet was settling in, and with it, a new kind of tension, the tension of what came next. They sat on the porch step, watching the last light fade from the mountains. "Crowley was right about one thing," Thaddeus said, breaking the long silence. Goldie tensed. "What, the water? We won, but the drought will come again. That spring is not infinite. A shared ditch is a good start, but it won't be enough when the dry season hits hard." "What are you thinking?" "Thaddeus." He pointed with his chin toward the high ground behind the house. "We should build a cistern, a real one, a water tower, up at the headwaters. We could fill it in the wet season, and in the dry. We ration it, a set amount per family, per acre, enough for all to survive. Not enough for one to get rich. A community bank, but for water." Goldie looked at him, really looked at him. This was the man who had come to town a shadow, trusting no one, asking for nothing. "A community tower," she said softly. "You'd trust them after everything." He was quiet for a moment, watching the first star appear. "I trust you, and you seem to trust them. That's a start." A small smile touched her lips. "You trust people more than you think. Mr. Hale, maybe." He allowed. The silence that fell between them now was different. It was warm, expectant. Goldie stood up and went inside the dark house. Returning a moment later, she was holding a thick, coiled piece of leather. "I have something for you," she said. She held it out. He took it. It was a new belt for his saddle cantle, wide and strong, made of the finest dark tan leather. The edges were perfectly burnished, the stitching so small and neat it looked like it had been done by a machine. But he knew it was her work, and in the center, she had carved 2 sets of initials, a bold, strong WR for winter range, and woven through them, in a softer, flowing script, were her own. GS. Thaddeus stood there, the leather cool in his good hand. He traced the letters with his calloused thumb. He touched the stitches, one by one. He felt a strange, unfamiliar tightness in his throat, a stinging behind his eyes that he had not felt since he was a child. He was a man who had owned nothing, who had expected nothing, and here, in his hand, was a promise, a brand, a belonging. He could not find the words. He just looked at her. Goldie saw the emotion he was trying to hide, the shimmer in his eyes before he blinked it away. She understood. She held out her hand. "Come on," she said softly. "What, just, come on." She led him to the center of the porch. She put her hand on his good shoulder. After a beat of hesitation, he slowly, carefully, placed his right hand on her waist. The touch was light, almost questioning. "I don't hear any music," he murmured, his voice rough. "We don't need any," she replied. She pushed off with her left foot. He mirrored her. Step, step, slide. Step, step, slide. A simple 2-step. There in the twilight. On the porch she had just swept clean. At first they were clumsy. He was stiff, favoring his injury. She was hesitant, unaccustomed to being this close to him, to anyone. By choice, they watched their boots scuffing the wooden planks. Two pairs of feet trying to find a common language. Step, step, slide. The wind chime gave a single, soft laugh. Thaddeus stopped looking at their feet and looked at her face. Her eyes were down, a small, concentrated frown on her lips. "You're thinking too hard," he said. She looked up. "You're leading with your bad shoulder? I'm not. You are." A smile sparked between them. It was not a grand, joyous smile. It was a small, real thing, a spark of warmth in the cool air. She relaxed. He loosened his grip, letting his arm settle more naturally at her waist. Step, step, slide. They found the rhythm. It was not in music. It was in the scuff of their boots on the wood, the whisper of the wind, and the beat of their own hearts, which seemed to be finding the same tempo. They moved as one, a slow, circling pattern on the small porch. The distance between them closed. Not all at once, but by small, unspoken degrees. His hand on her back became warmer, steadier. Her hand on his shoulder felt less like a guard and more like an anchor. The dance slowed, the steps becoming smaller, until they were barely moving at all. They just stood, swaying. In the center of the porch, the first crickets of the night began to sing. He lowered his head. She tilted hers up. Their foreheads touched. They stood like that for a long time, breathing in the same small space. He could smell the scent of her hair, soap and leather, and the faint, clean smell of the rain. Her eyes were closed. His were, too. His nose gently brushed hers. A simple, accidental touch that sent a jolt of warmth through her. This was not passion. It was not fire. It was something more rare. It was peace. It was the deep, shuddering exhale after a lifetime of running. The dance ended, but they did not move apart. Goldie let her head rest against his chest, right over his heart. She could feel the steady, strong thump, thump, thump beneath her ear. It was the surest sound in the world. Thaddeus rested his chin on the top of her hair, his good arm holding her close. They were two broken, jagged pieces, and for the first time, they were not cutting each other. They were fitting. They had learned, finally, how to breathe together. They stood there as the moon rose, casting the valley in pale, clean silver, but even in the safety of his arms. Goldie O'Brien, Goldie Sutton, knew she was not finished. She had her land. She had her water. She had this man, but she remembered the terror. She remembered the feeling of being a pawn, a piece of property in a man's game, with no voice and no choice. She thought of the post office notice, and Mrs. Davies's daughter, and the other women in other, smaller towns, facing their own Bellamys, their own Crowleys, with no one to stand for them. She had her forge. She had her rights. And now, she had a voice. A new plan was beginning to smolder. A new fire was being kindled. It was one more thing she had to do. 1 week later, the town hall was full again, but the air was not thick with fear. It was sharp with the clean, uncertain smell of new lumber and fresh ink. Goldie Sutton stood at the front, not on a platform, but on the same floor as everyone else. Thaddeus and Maeve flanked her, not as guards, but as partners. "What happened in the church?" Goldie began, her voice quiet but carrying to the back wall. "Was not just about me. It was about a sickness. It was about using laws as weapons and people as property. Today, we start the cure." She unrolled a fresh sheet of ledger paper on the meeting table. "This is the Free Will Registry. From this day forward, no marriage license will be issued by Judge Hollister, or any judge after him, unless both parties come here, to this book, and sign their names in front of 2 witnesses. A signature that says, 'I come to this of my own accord, without threat or debt binding me.'" A murmur of approval, deep and resonant, came from the women gathered at the back. "And for those who cannot speak," Goldie continued, her gaze finding Mrs. Davies and her young daughter, "Clara, for those who are trapped on a remote ranch, who are being convinced by a locked door or a heavy hand, there is this She pointed to a simple, locked wooden box on the table. "This is the anonymous ledger. A message, a note. Even just a name slipped under the marshal's door or given to one of Maeve's riders will be placed in here, and Judge Hollister will review it, and the law will investigate. Silently, before a wedding can ever be announced." Maeve Callahan stepped forward, and the room's attention snapped to her. She looked, as always, as if she was carved from prairie granite. "A law is only as good as the arm that carries it," Maeve stated, her voice flat. "We all know a summons can get lost on the way to a place like the Double C. A man can be delayed. From now on, that stops." She gets to a half-dozen young women, including Jeb Hemlock's eldest daughter, standing near the door. They were all in split skirts, their faces proud. "These are Maeve's messengers. I am training them myself. They know these hills as well as any man. They can ride as hard, and they will not be persuaded to take a detour. When this court," she nodded to Hollister, "issues an order of protection, or a summons for coercion, one of these women will deliver it, and it will be delivered." It was a quiet revolution, happening right in front of them. The power map of the valley was being redrawn. Finally, Judge Hollister stood. He held a single sheet of paper. "And to ensure this particular brand of evil never takes root again," the judge declared, his voice booming, "I am signing into law the Bitter Willow Water Compact. It has two simple, ironclad rules. First, any future pipeline, ditch, or diversion that affects more than one property must be put to a full community vote. A simple majority rules. Second, the water rights of this valley are hereby declared a communal resource, not a private commodity. They cannot, under any circumstance, be included in a marriage contract, a debt lien, or any other personal obligation. The water belongs to the land, and the land belongs to the people who work it." He signed the paper with a flourish and slammed his seal down. It was done. The weapons Crowley and Bellamy had used isolation, coercion, and the law itself had been dismantled, piece by piece. The town breathed. People began to talk, to plan. They spoke of the communal water cistern Thaddeus had proposed, of the irrigation ditch, of the spring harvest. Goldie and Thaddeus slipped out of the crowded room. Their part in the public reckoning finished. They walked for 2 days, taking their time. They packed light, just a bedroll, some coffee, and hardtack. Thaddeus led her up from the valley floor, past the grasslands, into the high, rocky country where the wind was born. His shoulder was healing, the sling long since discarded, though he still moved with a deliberate care. They made camp on the second evening, just below a high, wind-swept ridge. The place was called Singing Slate. It was a strange, beautiful, desolate landscape, where thin shards of dark gray rock jutted from the earth like the teeth of a fallen giant. And when the wind blew, as it always did, it moved through the 1,000 narrow gaps, creating a sound. It was not a whistle, but a low, complex chord, a constant, mournful, and beautiful song. They sat by a small, crackling fire, sharing a tin cup of coffee. The silence between them was comfortable, layered with all the things they had survived. "Why did you bring me here?" Goldie asked, watching the stars prick through the deep violet sky. Thaddeus looked into the fire. "My father brought me here once, a long time ago, before everything. He said it was the one place where the earth itself had a voice, where you couldn't lie, because the rock was always singing the truth." He turned to her, his face serious in the firelight. "I want to ask you something, Goldie, and I want to do it here. No town, no crowds, no judge, no obligations." He reached out his good hand, not to touch her, but just held it open, palm up. "I need you to know. I did not come back to Bitter Willow to save you from a vow. I did not fight Crowley to win you as a prize. I fought him because he was wrong, and you were right." He took a steadying breath, and she saw the raw vulnerability in his eyes. The gunslinger was gone. This was just a man. "I am here before any vow," he said, his voice rough. "I am here to ask, Goldie Sutton, will you choose to make a vow with me? Will you make it ours? Goldie looked at him, and the last tight, cold knot of fear that had lived in her chest for a year finally, truly, let go. A tear slipped from her eye. Not in sadness, but in a profound, earth-shaking relief. It was the relief of being seen, the relief of being asked, the relief of choice. She laughed, a small, wet sound that was swallowed by the wind. "Thaddeus Hale," she said, her voice clear and strong. "I choose you. I am not running from anything. I am not paying a debt. I am not doing it out of fear. I am doing it for me, for us. Yes, I choose yes." He did not move for a second, as if he was memorizing the words. Then a slow smile, a real one, spread across his face, transforming his harsh features into something achingly tender. He closed the small distance between them. He did not grab her. He placed his hand gently along her jaw, his thumb brushing away the tear on her cheek. He leaned in, and she met him halfway. Their first kiss was not a fire. It was water. It was the quenching of a desperate, lifelong thirst. It was slow and deep and honest. It tasted of coffee and wood smoke and the faint salt of her tears. It was a kiss of survivors, a kiss that spoke of pain and healing and a shared, rugged future. It was a promise that they would be each other's shelter. Her hands, small and strong, came up to tangle in his hair, pulling him closer. His arm, the one that had been broken, wrapped around her waist, strong and sure, lifting her slightly, bringing her flush against his chest. They held each other for a long time, just breathing, while the wind sang its truth over the stones. When they finally broke apart, the moon was high, bathing the slate in silver. Thaddeus pulled a small clasp knife from his pocket. He did not offer her a ring. He offered her his hand. She took it. Together, they walked to the largest, smoothest slab of stone, hand in hand. They knelt in the dirt. He opened the knife and, with their hands still clasped, they worked together, carving their truth into the rock. It was not a poem. It was not a date. It was just two sets of initials, simple and permanent. G, S, and right next to it, T, H, down in the valley. Weeks later, the new communal cistern was full. The first irrigation ditch, dug by 10 families, was complete. A long, simple wooden trough ran through the center of town, the fresh, clean water of the cotton draw burbling through it. The entire town was there. It was a celebration. Jeb Hemlock, on behalf of the ranchers, gave a speech. Mrs. Davies, on behalf of the townswomen, said a prayer. Then it was time. Goldie and Thaddeus were given the honor of drawing the first bucket. Thaddeus worked the new pump handle, and Goldie held the oaken bucket as it filled with clear, life-giving water. But she did not take it for herself. She turned, the bucket heavy in her hands, and walked to the front of the line. She scanned the crowd, and her eyes found Clara, her new apprentice, standing shyly beside her mother. Goldie smiled. She and Thaddeus, together, held the heavy bucket out. "You're first," Goldie said. The little girl looked at her mother, who nodded, her eyes shining. Clara stepped forward and, with both hands, took the bucket. Her face lit up, bright with a purpose and a promise she was only just beginning to understand. From the porch of the Winter Range Ranch, far up the hill, a small, iron wind chime sounded a single, clear, laughing note. The town, which had almost died from a forced and terrible yes, had finally, truly, learned the power of the word no. And in doing so, they had all found their way, together, to a yes that meant something. Thank you so much for listening to this story. We would love to know where you are listening from. So please drop a comment below to say hello and share your thoughts. Be sure to subscribe to Wild West Stories 1850 like this video, and give us your support by hitting the hype button to help this story be heard by more people.